Hello. For this lecture, we are going to discuss the sensory motor system, how we move. Okay, I know we've discussed this before, but I want to put it on here again since this is one of our sensory systems. It's important to know that it is built in a hierarchical fashion, okay? So there is functional segregation seen. You can see that on the left-hand side where it says receptors, thalamus, to primary sensory, to secondary sensory, to association, etc. However, just remember that there is parallel processing also. So if you look to the right, you'll notice that, for instance, the thalamus can actually bypass primary sensory cortex and affect actually directly secondary sensory cortex. Okay, and then there is also the passing of information between the different association cortices. Okay, the other thing on this slide is again the definition between sensation and perception. Just remember that sensation is produced by all humans in pretty much the same fashion as the detection of a stimulus, whereas perception is the interpretation of that stimulus and can be done very differently by different individuals. Okay, let's talk about the physical energy for the somatosensory system. Okay. So we have Pacinian corpuscles, which are skin receptors that respond to vibration and pressure. You'll see the one there on the right-hand side where it's pointing to vibration. That would be a Pacinian corpuscle. They are also sensitive to textures. Okay. We perceive the form of objects we touch through Meissner's corpuscles, which respond to changes in stimuli, and through Merkel's discs, which respond to isolated points. Okay. Ruffini corpuscles detect stretching of the skin when we move fingers or limbs. And you'll see the example there for the stretch in the figure. And then free nerve endings in the skin respond to pain, heat, and cold. So there's actually there's a lot of physical energy in our environment. It can be temperature, it can be movement, it can be stretching, vibration. All of those things are the physical energy that is interpreted by the somatosensory cortex. Okay, so I'm just going to give you an example here of a Pacinian corpuscle. So you'll notice that a stimulus to the corpuscle opens sodium channels and produces a graded generator potential. We now know that sodium wants in because of electrostatic pressure and because of diffusion. Okay, and so that sodium coming in, if it's enough, it might reach threshold, which would then cause an action potential. Okay, so this is the way that the Pacinian corpuscles are acting as the transducer, taking that physical energy and then turning it into a signal, in this case, this action potential. But it's going to be, of course, thousands and thousands of these action potentials and sending it up to the brain where it can be interpreted as such. Also, remember the somatosensory system can determine whether body sensations arise from outside or inside the body. And there's receptive fields, okay, which are regions in which a stimulus will alter a sensory neuron's firing rate. So you'll notice that in the cat subject there, the receptive field for cortical neuron A is on the top, and then the receptive field for cortical neuron B is on the bottom, and the top one is going to be the front leg, and then the bottom is the tail. So basically what you're looking at here is, again, the mapping, okay, of the body to the cortical area. And we'll see that mapping for the motor cortex and for the somatosensory cortex. Okay, now let's look at the pathway to that somatosensory cortex. So each sensory system has a distinctive pathway from the periphery to the central nervous system. Here, I gave you an example of the dorsal column system. So this delivers touch information. Receptors send axons via the dorsal spinal cord to synapse onto neurons in the brainstem. You see that in the figure. Okay. Axons from those neurons cross the midline and go to the thalamus. Okay, again, that thalamus being that switching station, saying, oh, you know what, this is input that needs to go to somatosensory cortex. And therefore, it sends it up to the primary somatosensory cortex. At all levels, inputs are organized into dermatomes, which are strips of skin, each innervated by a particular spinal nerve. Information about each sensory modality is sent to a different region of the thalamus where it is emphasized or suppressed. Okay? So think about that. If it's a heat modality, if it's a stretch modality, if it's a pain modality, it's going to be sent to the thalamus, and the thalamus is going to then act like that switching station, saying, okay, which one of these is it? Okay? And so at the bottom, I put, if the sensory modality is heat or movement information, then it would be sent to the primary somatosensory cortex. So again, you're looking at a hierarchical organization here: spinal cord to brainstem to thalamus to the primary sensory cortex. But once it gets up to that level, you now see some arrows going back and forth between primary and non-primary and different association cortices. Okay, so now still working on pathway to somatosensory cortex. Now we've reached all the way up to the top cortical level. You'll notice that this cortex is posterior to the central sulcus. Okay, so we call it the post-central gyrus, okay, because it's posterior to the central sulcus. Okay, and it receives touch information from the opposite side of the body. So this body movement and sensation is provided in the body in a contralateral manner, which means that stuff on the left side of the body is processed by the right hemisphere, stuff on the right side of the body is processed by the left hemisphere. Okay. And then S1 cells are arranged as a map of the body, which is a sensory homunculus. And you see the homunculus in C there. This is just representing that there's a lot of cortical area devoted to the hands, a lot of cortical area devoted to the face in comparison to other areas of the body. Okay. Then after the somatosensory cortex, now we're dealing with association cortices, or areas in the brain that process a mixture of inputs from different modalities. You'll notice here that, again, it's not only just that post-central gyrus, but now there's a gyrus even behind that. That's what we're focusing on here in this association area. And polymodal neurons allow different sensory systems to interact. Cortical maps are highly plastic, which means they change, okay? And they often change as a result of experience. I'll give you a couple of examples. So individuals who are play guitars or violins, things like that, and they might see a greater cortical representation of their left fingers when they're playing with those on those strings. Or reorganization of maps due to loss of a body part or reinstatement of a body part. And we see this a lot. And let's say somebody loses a finger or loses a couple fingers, and then we see the reorganization in the somatosensory cortex. Okay. Okay, we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about pain, because pain is actually something that is very multifarious. We could focus a lot of time just on the topic of pain, but we're going to do it here in 2 or 3 slides just to give you an example here. Okay, so pain is the discomfort associated with tissue damage. Okay. And it's different. That's why we're focusing on it so much. It's different than just other sensations like vibration, things like that. But what's interesting about pain is that all those different sensory modalities can end up becoming pain. Okay. So a stretch that's stretched too far becomes painful. A temperature or heat becomes too high, becomes painful. Okay, so it is kind of its own sensory system. The McGill Pain Questionnaire describes 3 aspects of pain. So if it wasn't already complicated enough, we have a sensory discriminative dimension, which here we're looking at throbbing, gnawing, shooting pain. But we also have motivational affective dimensions. What about being fearful? What about being sickened? Okay. And then cognitive evaluative dimensions. Okay. No pain, mild, excruciating, but just thinking about painful, like that, for instance, a painful heartbreak. Okay. That's a cognitive, that's an emotional pain. Okay. Now we're going to focus more on the nociceptors, which are peripheral receptors on free nerve endings that respond to painful stimuli. Okay. If we focus on the anterolateral system, it transmits the sensations of pain and temperature to the brainstem. You see those in the figure on the right-hand side, okay? Beginning at the spinal cord and then moving on its way up. Nerve fibers send axons into the dorsal horns of the spinal cord. Within the spinal cord, glutamate, we know that that is one of the most prolific excitatory neurotransmitters. Any peptide substance P are released to boost pain signals. They synapse on spinal neurons that project to, and you'll see this in the figure, to the pons, then up to the midbrain, the paraaqueductal gray to be specific, then to the thalamus, and then to the somatosensory cortex. Okay. And pain information, I didn't want to leave this out, is also integrated in the cingulate cortex. Okay. Plays another role in pain perception. And now pain relief, because pain is, like I mentioned, so multifarious, there's a lot of different ways that we can relieve the pain as well. Okay. So if you look at psychogenic, we can relieve pain through placebos, through hypnosis, okay, through decreasing stress. We can do it through cognitive means. We can do it through biofeedback, relaxation training, all those kinds of things. What we're referring to there when we're identifying ways to relieve pain is we're using that gate control theory, okay, which says that spinal gates control the signal that goes to the brain. The idea being here is that there's these pain signals that are being sent into the spinal cord up to the cortex repeatedly all the time. If you're in chronic pain, it's just all the time that these pain sensations are being sent up to the brain. Okay. But maybe there's a way through hypnosis, through biofeedback, relaxation training, that you can shut or close those gates so that that pain sensation does not make it up to the brain. So the idea is that you're closing the gate, the brain can only process so much information at one time, and you're flooding it with a lot of good and positive things, okay, that is going to then subside that pain. Okay, so that's the belief. That's how hypnosis and relaxation techniques and stuff work. From a pharmacological point, here we're dealing with analgesia, right? The decrease or reduction in pain. We can do that through opiate drugs, okay, including the endorphins, which bind to specific receptors in the brain. So endorphins are going to be our endogenous opioids, or we can take other opiate drugs. We can do epidurals or intrathecal injections, which place opiates directly into the spinal cord. You can also use transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation, known as TENS, which relieves pain by stimulating the nerves around the source of the pain. The placebo effect is relief of a symptom, even though the treatment is an inert substance, and that's also been shown to reduce pain. Acupuncture relieves pain by inducing endorphin release. Again, remember, those are the endogenous opioids that decrease pain. And of course, stress can alter the analgesia system. So if you have chronic pain and you become very stressed, those pain levels are probably going to be increased. Okay? If you do have chronic pain and you're able to learn better coping strategies for stress, then your pain relief might be improved. Okay, so now we talked about the physical energy for the somatosensory system. Now we are going to talk about the physical energy for the motor system. Okay? A movement is a single relocation of a body part, usually resulting from a brief muscle contraction. Okay? A motor plan is a set of muscle commands that is established before the action occurs. So we're going to learn here shortly that we're talking about areas in the cortex that tell the motor system you need to move your arm, okay, away from a source of some sort, or you need to grab and hold something. Okay, so that's the motor plan. Motor plan is telling the skeletal muscles, right, that need to be moved, and we can identify the movement or activity of muscles using the electromyograph, the EMG. Okay? And muscles and skeletal bones work together to move the body. Tendons connect muscle to bone in a reciprocal fashion, which means that in the picture on the right, you'll notice that the biceps, okay, bi meaning two muscles that run parallel here. So biceps, for those to contract, then the triceps on the posterior side of the arm, which are three parallel muscles, triceps, okay, those have to relax. The triceps must relax in order for the biceps to be activated, okay? And so that would be an antagonistic group, okay? Where if muscles act together to move a limb, then they're called a synergist. Okay, so the physical energy, right, is all going to be about movement. So let's look a little deeper into this. Motor neurons of the spinal cord and brainstem send action potentials down their axons to innervate muscles. And at this neuromuscular junction, where the motor unit, and when we mean by motor unit, that's the motoneuron terminal and the muscle fiber, where these two things meet, the neurotransmitter acetylcholine is released. Okay. So again, if this neuromuscular junction, this motor neuron is going to be the transducer, okay, taking that physical energy and turning it into something that the brain can interpret. Okay. Now, proprioception, okay, is the collection of information about body movements and position. Okay. And there's two kinds. First, a muscle spindle is a capsule buried in other muscle fibers that contains intrafusal fibers, and it responds to stretch. And you'll see that in the top figure up there. If a muscle is stretched, the muscle spindle also stretches and triggers action potentials in afferent sensory nerves. The signal informs the spinal cord and brain about the extent and rate of stretch. Okay. Now, the figure on the right-hand side, oh, well, we'll get to that in just a second. The Golgi tendon organs, okay, are sensitive to muscle tension. The primary function of these tendon organs is to monitor the force of muscle contractions, and they also detect overloads on muscles and cause a reflexive relaxing of the muscle in order to prevent damage. Okay, so look at this intricate cycle here using the figure on the right-hand side. And you've probably been fooled before, okay? So remember, somebody hands you a book, okay? As soon as somebody hands you that book, you already have a motor plan, okay? You're already telling your brain, oh, this is about how heavy the book is going to be. I know how much muscle fibers, need to be contracted to hold this book, okay? If the book ends up being super heavy, then your arm just immediately goes down to the ground. Even though you can lift that book back up, no problem, it was the expectation, okay? It was that motor plan. So the motor plan tells the muscles to innervate, okay, to strengthen, okay? And then you hold those up. Now, let's say that you hold that book and the book is extremely heavy and you're almost going to drop it. Now that information is being sent from like these muscle spindles, Golgi tendons, right? And is also going to be sent up to the sensory system, the somatosensory system, because now there's pain involved. Okay? So you see how it's these systems, the somatosensory system, the motor system, are working together. Okay, almost all the time they're working together in conjunction so that you can identify movement, but also the other sensations like stretch and pain, etc. Okay, the hierarchy of motor control system. If we look here, starting with the skeletal system attached to muscles, they determine which movements are possible, send that information to the spinal cord to the brainstem, from brainstem right up to primary motor cortex. Okay, but there is also non-primary primary cortex, which is an additional source. We know that those are like association cortices areas. And then we can't forget the cerebellum and basal ganglia, which modulate movement activities via the thalamus. And we'll talk a little bit more about them in just a minute. Okay, so pathway to the motor cortex here. Body muscles are controlled via the spinal cord, following commands from the brain sent through two major pathways. Okay, the pyramidal system, or the pyramidal. The pyramidal system consists of neuronal cell bodies in the motor cortex located in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. Aha. So we talked about the central sulcus there. We talked about the posterior central gyrus, which was somatosensory cortex. Now we're talking about the precentral gyrus, which is the motor cortex. Okay. And remember, the central fissure separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So the motor cortex is in the frontal lobe, the somatosensory cortex is in the parietal lobe. Okay. Their axons pass through the brainstem to the spinal cord, where each pyramidal tract crosses to the contralateral side. Again, just like with the somatosensory cortex, it's processed in a contralateral manner. Okay. And then there's the extrapyramidal system, consists of other axon pathways with tracts that lie outside of the pyramids in the medulla. And many of these projections pass to the spinal cord via specialized motor regions of the midbrain and brain stem. And I don't want you to forget that, again, in the now we're looking at the primary motor cortex. It is also shaped like a homunculus. You see the strip there, the primary motor cortex, where there's a lot of cortex devoted to the hand, a lot of cortex devoted to the lips, the face, okay, in comparison to other parts of the body. Okay. Now, we talked a little bit about non-primary, but we're going to go in more detail here. This is still pathway to the motor cortex. Now we are up in the primary motor cortex, and now we're looking at other areas that help feed information in and out of that primary motor cortex. One of those areas would be the supplementary motor area. Okay? And you see that on the figure on the right-hand side. Important for initiation of movement sequences, especially when pre-planned. Okay? Again, looking at the book, you're already identifying how much do you think that book is going to weigh. Is it going to be any problem at all for you to hold, or is it going to be too heavy for you to hold? The premotor cortex, okay, anterior to the primary motor cortex. So similar functions here. Remember, we saw the primary somatosensory cortex, and then there was another gyrus to just posterior to that, okay, that also worked with the primary sensory cortex. Well, here now you're looking at the precentral gyrus, and now a premotor cortex that is anterior to it. Okay, and it contains cells called mirror neurons, activated when motor sequences are guided by external events. These neurons fire when observing another individual making the same movement. And this is fascinating, guys. We can see this in PET scans and MRIs, functional MRIs, where the individual is actually watching somebody else do an action, okay, and their motor areas are lighting up, okay, because they're thinking to themselves, here's how would I put together my motor plan, right, to mimic this same behavior. The motor cortex damage, let's say it's damaged due to a stroke, can cause paralysis, plegia, or weakness, paralysis of voluntary muscles. Damage to non-motor zones produces complicated changes in motor control, such as apraxia, which is the inability to carry out movements, even though no paralysis or weakness is present. So what we've identified here through stroke victims and so on is that when these association cortex or cortices, SMA, okay, premotor cortex, when they are damaged, we see these different paralysis. And then I told you we wouldn't forget these two guys. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, because they are big motor areas, but they're not part of the primary motor cortex. Okay. The basal ganglia are a group of interconnected forebrain nuclei that modulate movement. The basal ganglia consists of the caudate nucleus, putamen, and globus pallidus, okay, with inputs from the substantia nigra and subthalamic nucleus. The basal ganglia helps control the amplitude and direction of movement and are important in initiation of movement, as well as movements performed by memory rather than by sensory control. Okay, and all of those parts are shown to you on the left-hand side there. The cerebellum receives inputs from sensory sources and other brain motor systems, and it guides movement through initiation and really helps fine-tune skilled movements. Okay, that is the cerebellum's specialty. And then the last thing I want to show you there is that little bullet point. It says, notice additional areas of association cortex. So notice these big posterior parietal association cortex, big areas here, okay, that are feeding information in and out. So, and areas from posterior parietal association cortex can go straight to areas of secondary motor cortex, okay, as you'll notice there. Okay, and that is it for the motor system.